My own mother uninvited me from our family's annual Martha's Vineyard reunion, so my brother-in-law could use my bedroom as a storage closet for his golf clubs. She told me to stay home because my lack of refinement would embarrass his wealthy relatives. She had no idea that my glorified junk selling had just made me a millionaire. So instead of crying, I bought the historic beachfront cottage they desperately wanted to rent. And when they tried to break in and claim it as their own, I made sure my housewarming party included a high-powered attorney and a local deputy. My name is Tessa, and I am 35 years old. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled my family's toxic hierarchy, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your own relatives exactly who they are dealing with and show them that your boundaries are carved in stone. The defining moment of my complete liberation started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in the middle of a sprawling, mid-century modern estate in Atlanta, carefully cataloging a collection of 18th-century French porcelain. My appraisal firm specializes in high-end estate liquidations. It requires a sharp eye, immense patience, and a deep understanding of hidden value. Ironically, my family possessed none of those traits. My phone vibrated heavily in my blazer pocket, breaking the quiet concentration of the dusty room. I pulled it out and saw a notification from the family group chat. The chat was obnoxiously titled, Vineyard Summer 2026. For as long as I could remember, our family had spent the last week of August in Oak Bluffs. It is a deeply rooted tradition for affluent African American families, a sacred time for community legacy, and in my mother Evelyn's case, aggressive social climbing. I tapped the screen to read the message. It was from my mother, and it was not a question, it was a mandate. Tessa, we are finalizing the sleeping arrangements for the rental house next month. Garrett just bought a custom set of Callaway golf clubs, and Brianna has her new designer steamer trunks. They simply cannot squeeze all of that into their suite. We are going to need your room for their storage. You will have to sit this year out. We will send you postcards. I stood perfectly still in that quiet estate, the cool porcelain resting in my gloved hands. There was no apology. There was no offer to find me a nearby hotel or an alternative solution. I was simply being erased to make room for luggage and sporting goods. My sister Brianna had always been the golden child, pampered and protected, while I was the designated shock absorber for my mother's endless critiques. Brianna had recently married Garrett, a white man, whose arrogance was only matched by his remarkably mediocre accomplishments. But to my mother, Garrett's generational wealth and country club status made him absolute royalty. I placed the porcelain bowl safely back into its padded crate, took off my gloves, and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice practically dripping with artificial sweetness. I assume you saw the text, Evelyn said, not even bothering to say hello. I did see it, I replied, keeping my voice entirely level and calm. I am calling to clarify why my presence in our family tradition is suddenly less important than Garrett's sporting equipment. My mother let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. This is exactly why you make things so difficult, Tessa. Everything has to be a dramatic confrontation with you. Garrett's family comes from serious money. They are bringing some very important contacts to the island this year. Brianna needs to host them properly. It is about making the right impression and maintaining a certain standard. And my presence would ruin that impression, I asked, leaning against a heavy mahogany credenza. I could hear the clinking of ice in a glass on her end of the line. Let us be honest with ourselves, my mother said, her tone shifting from dismissive to openly cruel. You do not exactly fit the aesthetic they are accustomed to. You spend your days rummaging through dead people's attics. You are single. You do not have the refinement for the kind of cocktail hours Brianna is organizing. Your antique business is just glorified junk selling. It is embarrassing when Garrett's friends ask what you do for a living. I want Brianna's summer to be absolutely perfect, and frankly, you do not blend in with their crowd. You would just be sitting in the corner looking miserable anyway. Her words hit the air with the precision of a scalpel. It was the exact same narrative she had pushed my entire life. When Brianna wanted to go to an Ivy League university, my mother happily drained the college fund to ensure her golden child had the absolute best. When I was accepted into an elite art history program, I was told to take out student loans because I needed to learn the value of independence. Every achievement I ever earned was systematically minimized, while every basic milestone Brianna crossed was celebrated with catered parties. I was always expected to shrink myself so Brianna could shine. But standing in that multi-million-dollar estate surrounded by wealth, I was personally managing and liquidating the old wounds, suddenly felt completely hollow. I realized I was no longer the frightened girl trying to earn a seat at a table where I was never truly wanted. I realized in that exact second that arguing with Evelyn was a phenomenal waste of my breath. I did not need her validation, and I certainly did not need her permission to exist on Martha's Vineyard or anywhere else. I took a deep breath and let the heavy silence stretch across the cellular connection until she shifted uncomfortably on the phone. "Are you still there?" my mother snapped. "I am here," I said smoothly. "I completely understand your position, Evelyn. Do not worry about my room. Have a wonderful time on the island." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone across the room. I did not text my friends to complain about the injustice of it all. Instead, I walked over to my leather briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I sat down at the vintage desk and logged into my primary business banking account. Just 2 days prior, I had closed the largest estate liquidation of my entire career, securing an astronomical commission that most people only dream of seeing in a lifetime. I stared at the massive 7-figure balance glowing brightly on the screen. My mother truly thought I was a junk seller. Garrett thought I was a poor, uncultured spinster dragging down their social stock. They had absolutely no idea the kind of financial firepower I had quietly amassed through years of relentless hard work and strategic investments. I opened a new tab on my browser and typed in the web address for the most exclusive real estate brokerage on Martha's Vineyard. For years, I had watched my family rent cramped houses blocks away from the water pretending they were island elites, while complaining about the lack of amenities. If my family did not have room for me in their pathetic rental house, that was perfectly fine. I was going to buy my own space. I navigated straight to the premium listings for the historic Inkwell Beach area, the most coveted and culturally significant stretch of real estate in Oak Bluffs. I sorted the properties by highest price first. I was not looking for a vacation rental. I was looking for a permanent fortress. I clicked on a stunning, fully renovated gingerbread cottage, sitting directly on the shoreline, listed for a cash-only immediate sale. I picked up my phone again, dialed the listing agent, and told him I wanted to write an offer immediately without contingencies. The game had officially changed, and my family had no idea they had just handed me the rulebook. 2 days later, I was standing on the top deck of the fast ferry departing from Woods Hole, with the salty Atlantic breeze whipping through my hair. The familiar silhouette of Martha's Vineyard slowly grew larger on the horizon. For my entire life, this island had represented a stressful performance. It was a place where my mother paraded us around to prove our worth to other affluent families while keeping me firmly tucked in the background. But today the island looked entirely different. It looked like a blank canvas. I had arranged to meet with Julian, a veteran luxury real estate broker who catered exclusively to high-net-worth clients demanding absolute discretion. Julian was waiting for me at the Oak Bluffs Marina in a sleek black SUV. He did not ask questions about why I was buying a house in the middle of the summer season. He simply handed me a bottle of sparkling water and drove us directly to the property I had inquired about online. As we turned onto the road hugging the coastline, Julian began reciting the historical pedigree of the area, but I was barely listening. My eyes were locked on the stunning piece of architecture waiting for us at the end of the street. The house was a flawless example of the island's famous Victorian gingerbread cottages, but elevated to a standard of modern luxury. It sat directly across from Inkwell Beach. The exterior was painted a sophisticated coral, with pristine white trim, showcasing intricate wooden scrollwork that framed an expansive wraparound mahogany porch. Julian unlocked the heavy custom door and stepped aside to let me enter first. The inside was breathtaking. Whoever had restored the property understood the delicate balance between historical preservation and absolute comfort. The original heart pine floors had been beautifully refinished to a warm honey glow. The living space was open and flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean. There was a massive chef's kitchen featuring imported marble countertops and top-of-the-line appliances. Most importantly, the entire house was equipped with a state-of-the-art central air conditioning system, which was an incredibly rare and expensive luxury for these historic seaside properties. I walked through the four spacious bedrooms, running my hand along the custom wainscoting. I stopped in the master suite, which featured French doors opening onto a private second-story balcony overlooking the water. This was not just a vacation home. It was a fortress of tranquility. It was the exact opposite of the cramped, chaotic rentals my mother usually booked, where I was expected to sleep on a pull-out couch near the kitchen. "We can do a standard 30-day close if you need to arrange financing," Julian said casually as we walked back downstairs. I shook my head and pulled a certified financial letter from my leather tote bag. "There will be no financing, Julian. I am making a full cash offer at the asking price. I want the paperwork expedited, and I want the keys in my hand by tomorrow afternoon." Julian raised an eyebrow in pleasant surprise, but quickly recovered his professional demeanor. He made a few rapid phone calls, and within 24 hours, the ink was drying on a stack of legally binding documents. The wire transfer cleared my business account seamlessly. The deed was recorded with the county clerk. Just like that, I became the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar piece of prime Martha's Vineyard real estate. When Julian finally handed me the heavy brass keys, I felt a physical shift in my chest. A generational weight had just been lifted off my shoulders. I was no longer the unwanted daughter begging for a corner of someone else's space. I was the master of my own domain. I locked the front door from the inside and walked out onto my sprawling mahogany porch. I sank into one of the plush outdoor lounge chairs and poured myself a glass of iced tea. I listened to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shoreline and closed my eyes, letting the late afternoon sun warm my face. It was absolute perfection. Then I heard the distinct sound of a heavy car engine struggling. I opened my eyes and looked down the street. A bulky black rental SUV was slowly crawling down the narrow road, dragging a small utility trailer behind it. I sat up straighter as the vehicle pulled up to the curb, about 4 houses down from my property. The doors opened, and familiar voices pierced the quiet neighborhood air. It was Evelyn, Brianna, and Garrett. I stayed perfectly still, hidden behind the wooden scrollwork of my porch railing as I watched the scene unfold. Garrett stepped out of the driver's side, wiping sweat from his red face. He looked furious. Brianna emerged from the passenger side wearing a linen designer outfit that was already wrinkled and clinging to her from the humidity. My mother stepped out of the back seat, looking absolutely horrified as she stared up at their summer rental. Garrett had spent months bragging in our family group chat about the exclusive luxury property he had secured through his elite connections. But the house they were standing in front of was a disaster. It was a dilapidated shack with peeling gray paint and a sagging roof. The tiny front yard was overgrown with weeds. There was a rusty window air conditioning unit precariously hanging out of the second-floor bedroom, which meant the rest of the house was currently a sauna. "Are you absolutely sure this is the right address, Garrett?" my mother asked. Her voice carried easily down the quiet street. Her tone was a mixture of panic and deep disappointment. Garrett aggressively slammed the car door. "Yes, Evelyn, this is the address. The pictures online made it look a little more modern, but the location is what matters." Brianna started whining immediately. "Garrett, I am not staying in there. It looks like it has mold. And where are we supposed to put my steamer trunks? The door is barely wide enough to walk through." I watched as Garrett marched around to the back of the trailer and began wrestling with his brand new custom golf clubs. The heavy bag caught on the metal latch of the trailer and tipped over, spilling expensive irons across the dusty pavement. Garrett cursed loudly, throwing his hands in the air while Brianna burst into tears. My mother stood on the cracked sidewalk, fanning herself with a magazine, looking miserable as the reality of their living situation set in. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced tea. The sweet taste of the cold drink was nothing compared to the absolute satisfaction washing over me. They had uninvited me and discarded my feelings so Garrett could have more space for his luxury lifestyle. Yet here they were sweating on the side of the road, staring down a miserable week in a sweltering shack. Meanwhile, I was sitting on the shaded porch of the most spectacular home on the street, completely unbothered. The universe had delivered the perfect opening act, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they wandered down the block and realized exactly who their new neighbor was. The next morning arrived with a brilliant sunrise and a crisp ocean breeze rolling off the Atlantic. I woke up in my massive California king bed feeling completely rejuvenated. The central air conditioning had kept the master suite at a perfect 68 degrees all night, ensuring I slept soundly without breaking a single drop of sweat. I took a long, leisurely shower in my custom marble bathroom, wrapped myself in a plush white robe, and walked barefoot down the gleaming hardwood stairs to my chef's kitchen. I took my time brewing a pot of premium Kona coffee in the French press. The rich aroma filled the open living space, grounding me in the reality of my new life. I poured the dark roast into an oversized ceramic mug and walked out the front door, locking the screen behind me. I settled into one of the deep wicker lounge chairs on my expansive mahogany porch and propped my feet up on the matching ottoman. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the rhythmic crashing of the waves against Inkwell Beach just steps away. It was approaching 9 o'clock when I finally saw them. Two familiar figures were trudging down the sidewalk, dragging their feet as if they were walking through thick mud. It was Brianna and Garrett. I did not move a muscle and simply took another sip of my hot coffee watching them approach. They looked absolutely devastated. Garrett was wearing a wrinkled salmon-colored polo shirt with dark sweat stains already bleeding through the fabric under his arms and across his chest. His usually perfectly styled hair was plastered to his forehead. Brianna looked even worse. Her expensive designer sundress was clinging to her damp skin, and her normally flawless hair had expanded into a frizzy, chaotic halo thanks to the relentless coastal humidity. It was incredibly obvious that the rusty window unit in their dilapidated rental shack had completely failed them during the night. They were likely heading toward the town center in a desperate search for iced coffee and air conditioning. As they walked past my property line, Garrett casually glanced up toward the beach. He stopped so abruptly that his sandals dragged against the pavement. He tapped Brianna heavily on the shoulder and pointed a shaky finger toward my porch. Brianna turned her head and squinted against the bright morning sun. When her eyes finally focused and landed on me, sitting comfortably on the grandest porch on the block, her jaw physically dropped. I offered a small, polite wave. Brianna immediately abandoned the sidewalk and stomped across my pristine, manicured lawn. Garrett followed closely behind her, his face twisting into a scowl. They marched up the wooden steps of my porch, stopping just a few feet away from my chair. They were both breathing heavily, radiating heat and the faint smell of cheap bug spray. "What in the world are you doing here?" Brianna demanded, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of a morning greeting. "I thought Mom told you there was no room for you." She did tell me that, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "So I made my own arrangements. It is a beautiful morning, is it not?" Brianna crossed her arms, shivering slightly despite the heat. "Our rental is a complete nightmare," she complained, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "The air conditioning is broken. There are mosquitoes everywhere. The beds feel like they are made of cardboard, and Garrett could not even fit his golf clubs in the hallway. It is a total disaster." I am very sorry to hear that, I said, taking another slow sip of my coffee. I warned Evelyn that waiting until the last minute to book a luxury rental usually ends poorly. Brianna ignored my logical point and began looking around the massive porch, peering through the large front windows into my beautifully furnished living room. Her eyes widened with greed as she took in the marble countertops and the central air vents visible on the ceiling. "How much did you pay to rent the guest suite here?" Brianna asked, narrowing her eyes at me. Before I could correct her flawed assumption, Garrett stepped forward, puffing out his chest. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and put on his best authoritative corporate voice. "Listen, Tessa, we had a miserable night. Brianna is exhausted and we need a proper place for the toddlers to sleep. You are just one person. You do not need a lot of space. Be a team player and hand over the keys to the main house. You can take whatever small guest room you rented here, and we will move our family into the main quarters. We will even let you eat dinner with us. I slowly lowered my coffee mug and placed it on the glass side table. I looked Garrett up and down, taking in his stained shirt and his overwhelming audacity. The fact that he believed he could simply order me to surrender my space to him was perfectly aligned with exactly how this family had always treated me. They saw my resources as an extension of their own privilege. I did not rent a guest suite, I said, my voice dropping to a calm but razor-sharp pitch, and I am not switching accommodations with you. Garrett rolled his eyes and sighed heavily, acting as if I were a petulant child throwing a tantrum. Do not be selfish, Tessa. I am not asking you, I am telling you. Give us the keys to the main house right now. We are family, and we need the space more than you do. I stood up from my chair, drawing myself up to my full height. I am not being selfish, Garrett. I am being precise. I cannot give you the keys to the main house because there is no guest suite. There is no landlord, and there is no lease. Brianna blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process my words. What are you talking about? She snapped. I own this property. I stated clearly, holding constant eye contact with my sister. I bought it yesterday. In cash. This is my home, and you are currently trespassing on my front porch. For a split second, the only sound was the ocean breeze rustling the leaves of the nearby oak trees. Then Garrett threw his head back and let out a loud, barking laugh. It was a deeply patronizing sound designed to make me feel small. You expect us to believe that? Garrett chuckled, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. A single woman selling dusty yard sale junk bought a multi-million-dollar piece of Inkwell real estate. Please, you probably sweet-talked some local into letting you house sit. Stop playing games and show me the lease right now. I want to see the paperwork. I looked at his outstretched, demanding hand. I looked at Brianna, whose face was caught between utter disbelief and boiling anger. I did not owe them an explanation. I did not owe them proof of my success, and I certainly did not owe them a place to stay. I picked up my coffee mug, turned my back on them without another word, and walked to my front door. Tessa, get back here! Garrett yelled, his laughter instantly replaced by red-faced fury. I am talking to you. I stepped over the threshold into the crisp, cool air of my magnificent foyer. I looked back at them one last time. Have a wonderful vacation, I said. I slammed the heavy, solid oak door directly in their sweating faces and firmly turned the brass deadbolt, locking them out of my peace forever. I had barely returned to my kitchen to pour a fresh cup of coffee when the noise started. It was not a polite tap on the door. It was a rapid, aggressive pounding that echoed loudly through the quiet foyer. It was the distinct, entitled knock of someone who firmly believed they owned whatever was on the other side of the wood. Exactly 10 minutes had passed since I locked Brianna and Garrett out. I knew exactly who was standing on my porch. I set my ceramic mug down on the imported marble counter and walked slowly back to the front of the house. I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open just enough to stand perfectly centered in the frame. I rested my hand casually against the door jamb, physically blocking the entrance. My mother Evelyn was standing there. She was wearing a wide-brimmed straw sun hat and an oversized pair of designer sunglasses. Her lips were pressed together in a tight, thin line. As soon as the door opened, she pushed the sunglasses up into her carefully styled hair and stretched her neck to peer past my shoulder. I watched her eyes widen as they darted around my grand foyer. She took in the sweeping hardwood staircase, the sparkling crystal chandelier, and the breathtaking view of the ocean visible through the large glass doors at the back of the house. I could literally see the wheels turning in her head as she calculated the immense value of the property. The naked greed in her expression was undeniable. Move out of the way, Tessa, she ordered, waving her hand dismissively at me. She stepped forward, fully expecting me to simply shrink back and let her glide right in. I did not move a single inch. Evelyn bumped lightly into my arm and stopped. Her perfectly drawn eyebrows furrowed in deep confusion. She looked up at me as if I had just spoken to her in a foreign language. What are you doing? She snapped, her voice sharp with irritation. Let me inside. It is absolutely suffocating out here in this humidity, and I need to see the rest of the layout. You do not need to see the layout, Evelyn, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly calm and even. You are not coming inside. She ignored my refusal entirely and continued craning her neck to look into my living room. That vintage mahogany credenza you placed in the hallway is completely wrong for the space, by the way, she critiqued, waving a perfectly manicured finger toward my antique furniture. It is far too heavy, and it blocks the natural light from the side window. We are going to have to move it against the far wall in the dining room before we invite the neighbors over for cocktails this evening. It is simply throwing off the entire feng shui of the entrance. I stared at her in utter disbelief. She had not even crossed the threshold of my home, and she was already attempting to redesign my interior and plan an imaginary social event for people she had not even met yet. Her ability to commandeer a situation and twist it to serve her own ego was truly remarkable. There is no we in this scenario, Evelyn, I said firmly, leaning slightly forward to block her line of sight. No one is moving my antique furniture. No one is hosting cocktail hours for the neighbors. And you are certainly not coming inside my house to dictate how I arrange my belongings. Evelyn gasped dramatically, placing a hand flat against her chest, as if my words had physically struck her. Garrett came storming back to the rental house, ranting like a madman about you buying property, she said, lowering her voice into an angry hiss. He said you refused to let your own sister use the house. I told him he was being completely ridiculous and that you were just throwing one of your little temper tantrums. But looking at this magnificent place, I see you actually did it. You bought a multi-million-dollar estate in Oak Bluffs, and you kept it a secret from your own mother. I did not keep it a secret. I corrected her without breaking eye contact. I bought it yesterday afternoon. I bought it exactly 1 hour after you explicitly texted me to say I was uninvited from the family trip because Garrett needed my bedroom to store his brand new golf clubs. You told me over the phone that I lacked the refinement to mingle with his wealthy friends. You said my business was just glorified junk selling. So I decided to take the profits from my junk selling and purchase my own refinement. Evelyn rolled her eyes, entirely unfazed by her own blatant hypocrisy. She let out a long, exasperated sigh and adjusted her expensive sun hat. Do not be so dramatic, Tessa, she scolded, acting as if my feelings were a minor inconvenience. I was simply trying to manage limited space at that awful rental house. You know how easily Brianna gets stressed when she does not have enough room for her wardrobe. But now that we have this gorgeous property in the family, everything is perfectly solved. I watched her seamlessly pivot from insulting me to claiming my success as a family asset. It was the exact dynamic I had endured for 35 years. Brianna and Garrett can take the master suite upstairs. Evelyn continued, already mapping out the logistics in her head. They need the privacy and the extra closet space for their steamer trunks. I will take the large guest room on the main floor because my knees cannot handle those stairs every day. You can use whatever small room is left over near the back of the house, or maybe set up a nice air mattress in the home office. Now step aside so I can inspect the kitchen. I need to text Garrett and tell him to bring the toddlers and the luggage over here immediately before they melt in that shack. I tightened my grip on the doorframe until my knuckles turned slightly white. The sheer audacity of her demands cemented every decision I had made over the last 48 hours. She did not see me as an independent, successful woman. She saw me as a convenient supplier of real estate for her favorite child. I am going to say this exactly once, Evelyn, so I suggest you listen very carefully, I said. My voice dropped an octave, radiating absolute authority. You do not have a guest room on the main floor. Brianna does not have the master suite. Garrett is not bringing his golf clubs, his toddlers, or his luggage through my front door. None of you are sleeping here. None of you are eating here. This is my private property, and it is not open for family occupation. Evelyn froze. The polite society mask she wore for the world completely vanished, leaving behind a cold, furious glare. She realized in that exact moment that I was not backing down. I was not the obedient scapegoat anymore. I was the homeowner holding the keys to the castle she desperately wanted to occupy. Her jaw clenched tight, and her eyes darkened with rage. This is absolutely unacceptable, she hissed, taking a half step back from the door. You are acting incredibly selfish and vindictive. I am your mother, and I demand respect. I am not going to stand out here on this porch sweating and arguing with you like a commoner in front of the whole neighborhood. We are going to have a formal family meeting right here and right now to correct this absurd behavior. I stood perfectly still in my grand foyer, listening to my mother breathing heavily on the other side of the thick wood. I genuinely expected her to turn around and march back to her sweltering rental shack. Instead, the brass handle rattled aggressively. When the deadbolt held firm, she began knocking again. This time it was not a demanding pound, but a sharp rhythmic tapping on the side window pane. She was not going to leave. She was going to stand on my porch and create a public spectacle until she got exactly what she wanted. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open, but I kept the reinforced iron security screen firmly locked between us. Evelyn was standing with her hands on her hips, her designer bag practically sliding off her shoulder in her agitation. "You are not going to simply shut the door in my face, Tessa," she snapped, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet morning air. "We are having this conversation right now, whether you like it or not." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, letting the cool air from my house wash over me. "I am listening, Evelyn," I said. "Make it fast." She took a deep breath and immediately launched into the exact same manipulative script she had used to control me since childhood. "You are 35 years old, and you are completely alone, Tessa. You have no husband. You have no children. You have absolutely zero dependents tying you down. Brianna is a devoted mother raising two beautiful toddlers. Those children are your own flesh and blood, and they are currently suffering in a house with no proper ventilation." I stared at her, watching how easily she weaponized my single status. According to my mother, my lack of a husband made my comfort entirely irrelevant. "It is your fundamental duty as an aunt, and as a member of this family, to surrender this space to them." Evelyn continued, her voice rising with dramatic self-righteousness. "Those babies need a clean, safe environment with reliable air conditioning. They need a yard to play in. You are just one person. What could you possibly need 4 bedrooms and a chef's kitchen for? You are being unbelievably selfish by hoarding this property when Brianna and Garrett are in desperate need." I did not flinch. I did not apologize. "My niece and nephew are not my financial responsibility, Evelyn," I replied, my voice completely flat. "Garrett brags constantly about his massive corporate salary and his family trust fund. If his children are sleeping in a hot shack, that is a direct result of his own poor planning and cheap budget. It has absolutely nothing to do with me." Evelyn scoffed loudly, waving her hand as if my logic was entirely offensive. "Do not bring Garrett's finances into this. He is a provider who makes smart, conservative investments. You, on the other hand, just got lucky. Do not stand behind that screen and act like you are some brilliant real estate mogul. You had one good week peddling other people's discarded trash to eccentric collectors. This entire purchase is a massive financial fluke, and we both know it." The insult was designed to strike my deepest insecurities, but it completely missed the mark. I had spent years building a highly respected appraisal firm from the ground up. I held degrees, certifications, and a client list that included some of the wealthiest estates on the East Coast. But to Evelyn, anything I accomplished without a man by my side was just a temporary stroke of luck. "You will run out of money eventually, Tessa," Evelyn warned, pointing a manicured finger at the mesh screen. "You will not be able to afford the property taxes or the upkeep on a historic home like this. You are in way over your head. The smartest thing you can do right now is let Garrett take over the management of the house. Let him move his family in and handle the logistics while you figure out your next step." I let out a short, dry laugh. "You want me to hand over my multi-million-dollar asset to a man who could not even successfully book a functional summer rental?" I asked. Evelyn slammed her palm against the iron screen. "It is about protecting the family name, Tessa," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into angry slits. "We have a reputation to uphold in Oak Bluffs. We are supposed to present a united, successful front to this community. What exactly do you think the neighbors are going to say when they see my grandchildren sweating in a miserable, run-down shack while you rattle around in a luxury mansion completely by yourself? You are making us look ridiculous." You are insulting the family name by refusing to share your resources. I looked past her shoulder at the pristine street and the sparkling blue ocean in the distance. The family name you are so desperately trying to protect is a complete illusion, Evelyn, I said, bringing my gaze back to her furious face. You care more about what strangers on this island think of you than you care about my basic humanity. You have spent my entire life teaching me that my only value is what I can provide for Brianna. That is an absolute lie. Evelyn interrupted, her voice shrill and defensive. It is the exact truth, I corrected her sharply. And the truth is, my resources are no longer available for public family consumption. My money is not a fluke, my success is not an accident, and this house is not a charity center for Garrett's bruised ego. Evelyn stared at me, her chest heaving with indignation. She was completely out of arguments. The guilt trip had failed. The duty card had failed. The insults to my career had failed. She was standing on the porch of a house she desperately wanted to control, and she had absolutely zero leverage to force her way inside. I took a step back from the door. You can stand on that porch until the sun goes down, Evelyn. You can scream at the neighbors and tell them exactly how selfish I am. I truly do not care. But you need to understand right now that the dynamic of this family has permanently shifted. I am the one holding the deed, and I am saying no. We are not done here, Tessa, she threatened, taking a step back toward the porch stairs. You are making a massive mistake. You are going to regret turning your back on your own blood. I reached for the solid oak door. I already turned my back, Evelyn, I said quietly. And the view from here is absolutely spectacular. I shut the heavy door firmly, closing off her angry protests, and twisted the brass lock one more time. I walked away from the locked oak door, fully expecting to hear the sound of Evelyn retreating down the wooden steps. Instead, I heard the aggressive clatter of her expensive wedge heels stomping across the mahogany floorboards of my porch. She was not leaving. She marched directly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows lining the front of my living room. I had opened the glass panes earlier that morning to let the ocean breeze circulate through the screens. Her face suddenly appeared framed by the white trim pressing aggressively close to the dark mesh. You are not going to simply lock me out and ignore me, Tessa, she barked, her voice slicing through the quiet hum of the ocean. I stopped in the middle of the living room and slowly turned to face the window. I walked over and stood just a few feet away from the screen, looking at my mother's distorted features through the wire mesh. I bought this house with my own money, Evelyn, I said, projecting my voice so she could hear me perfectly. Every single floorboard, every brick and every blade of grass on this property belongs to me. I earned it through a decade of relentless hard work. I owe you nothing. Evelyn let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded more like a bark. Your own money? She repeated, her tone dripping with heavy sarcasm. Please, do not stand there and act like you are completely self-made. You are only doing this to punish Brianna because you have always been deeply and insanely jealous of her. I stared at her, letting the sheer absurdity of her statement hang in the air. Jealous, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Why exactly would I be jealous of a woman who is currently sweating in a condemned shack while I am standing in my own multi-million-dollar coastal estate? Because you know I chose her. Evelyn snapped, her eyes flashing with a cruel, vindictive light. You are doing all of this to overcompensate because you have always resented the fact that I invested in your sister's obvious potential instead of yours. She took a breath and launched into the exact financial gaslighting she had weaponized against me since we were teenagers. I paid for Brianna's Ivy League tuition in full because she was destined for a certain caliber of life, Evelyn declared proudly, as if reading from a prepared manifesto. She needed to be in the right social circles. She needed to meet the right caliber of men like Garrett. It was a strategic family investment. You had to take out massive student loans for your little state college because you were perfectly average, Tessa. It was simple economics. Why would I throw away good money on an art history degree when your sister was clearly the one built for high society? The audacity of her revisionist history was truly breathtaking. She was openly admitting to financially crippling me at 18 years old and framing it as a logical business decision. When Brianna graduated completely debt-free, you bought her a brand new European luxury car as a reward, I reminded her. When I graduated with $80,000 in student loan debt, you handed me a generic greeting card and told me it was time to join the real world. You trained Brianna to be completely dependent on your financial padding while you forced me to become an absolute survivor. And now you are angry because the survivor outpaced the dependent. Brianna deserves the finer things in life because she was raised to appreciate them. Evelyn countered loudly, ignoring my facts entirely. Her voice rose with frantic entitlement. She knows how to host. She knows how to properly utilize a luxury space. You are just holding this massive property hostage because you are petty and vindictive. You want to force your sister to suffer just to satisfy your own massive inferiority complex. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over my mind. For years, I had internalized that exact narrative. I had spent my 20s working 3 jobs while carrying the crushing weight of student debt, constantly wondering why I was not good enough for my mother's financial support. But looking at her now, standing outside my window, begging for access to my assets, I finally saw the absolute pathetic nature of her logic. Let me make sure I understand your brilliant economic strategy, Evelyn, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. You drained your accounts to send Brianna to an Ivy League school so she could marry a man who supposedly has generational wealth. Yet that very same man cannot even afford to rent a functional house for his family on this island. Meanwhile, the daughter you deemed perfectly average and unworthy of a single dime of your support just bought the most expensive house on the block in cash. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her the space to breathe. You did not invest in Brianna's potential, I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority. You invested in your own vanity. You wanted a daughter you could parade around like a trophy at the country club. And now that your little social experiment is failing, you want me to swoop in and subsidize her luxury lifestyle with the money I made from the career you constantly belittle. You are twisting my words, Tessa! My mother hissed, her face flushing a deep, angry red. Brianna is a mother and she is accustomed to a certain standard of living. You are deliberately trying to humiliate her. I am not trying to humiliate anyone, I replied smoothly. I am simply existing in the reality that I built for myself. If Brianna's standard of living is so incredibly high, then she should probably ask her wealthy husband why he dragged her to a dilapidated shack with a rusty window unit. My real estate portfolio is not the backup plan for Garrett's financial incompetence. You are a cold, bitter woman, Evelyn spat, gripping the wooden window frame. You have no concept of family loyalty. You are turning your back on your own sister just to stroke your massive ego. I stepped right up to the window so my face was only inches from the screen. My ego is perfectly fine, Evelyn, but my tolerance for your manipulation is completely empty. We are finished here. She glared at me through the mesh, her chest heaving with unspent rage. She had thrown every piece of emotional ammunition she possessed, and none of it had left a single scratch on my armor. I watched her eyes dart around the porch, calculating her next move. The gaslighting had failed to break my resolve, and I could see her desperate mind searching for a completely different angle of attack. Evelyn took a slow, deliberate step back from the window screen. The frantic desperation that had clouded her eyes just moments ago suddenly vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating stillness that I recognized instantly. She realized that emotional manipulation and financial gaslighting were completely useless against me. So she was pivoting to her next tactic. I did not break eye contact. You have exactly 2 minutes to walk down those stairs and step off my property. Evelyn, I warned, my voice cutting through the humid air. If you are still standing on that mahogany wood when the clock runs out, I am calling the Oak Bluffs Police Department and having you formally trespassed from the premises. Evelyn did not look afraid. She did not look angry. Instead, a slow, malicious smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She reached into her designer leather bag and pulled out her smartphone. You really think you hold all the cards, Tessa? She sneered, tapping the screen with her manicured fingernail. You think just because your name is on some piece of paper you can treat your own mother like a criminal. You're about to learn a very hard lesson about how the real world works. I watched her dial a local number. She pressed the speakerphone button and held the device up near the wire mesh, ensuring I could hear every single word of the conversation. The line rang twice, before a deep voice answered, identifying himself as a dispatch operator for an island emergency locksmith service. Evelyn completely transformed her demeanor in a fraction of a second. The vicious venom she had just spit at me evaporated. Her tone became sweet, helpless, and laced with an artificial panic. "Oh, thank heavens you answered," Evelyn said, pressing her free hand against her chest as if she were in physical distress. "My name is Evelyn, and my family just arrived on the island for our summer vacation. It is an absolute disaster. My incredibly clumsy daughter managed to lose the keys to our beautiful new coastal property. We are completely locked out on the porch, and my two poor toddlers are practically melting in this terrible heat." I stood frozen in the center of my living room, astounded by the sheer, unadulterated fraud occurring right in front of my face. She was not just staging a dramatic standoff anymore. She was actively orchestrating a home invasion and disguising it as a routine family emergency. The dispatcher immediately sounded sympathetic. He asked for the address. Evelyn confidently recited my exact street numbers without missing a single beat. She spoke with the authority of a woman who genuinely believed the universe belonged to her. "We can have a technician out there in about 45 minutes, ma'am," the dispatcher assured her. "Since you do not have the keys, he will likely have to drill the deadbolt and completely replace the hardware. It will be an emergency service fee plus the cost of the new locks." "That is perfectly fine," Evelyn replied. Her eyes locked directly on mine through the window screen. "We will pay the emergency fee in cash the moment he arrives. Just please tell him to hurry. Our family simply cannot wait much longer to get inside our home." She tapped the screen and ended the call. The dial tone echoed briefly before she slipped the phone back into her bag. The helpless grandmother facade dropped instantly and the vicious smirk returned. "They will be here in less than an hour," Tessa Evelyn announced, crossing her arms in triumph. "And since you are refusing to act like a cooperative member of this family, I am simply taking charge of the situation just like I always do. The technician is going to drill right through that fancy brass lock of yours. By the time the sun sets, Brianna and Garrett will be completely unpacked in the master suite upstairs." "You just committed criminal fraud on a recorded commercial line, Evelyn," I stated, my voice eerily calm, despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. "It is not fraud if it is a shared family asset," she countered smoothly, waving her hand to dismiss my legal warning. "I am your mother. I gave you life. Half of everything you own is practically mine anyway. When the locksmith gets here, he will see a desperate mother trying to protect her grandchildren. And if you try to call the police and make a scene, the local authorities will just see a hysterical, bitter spinster trying to lock her own family out of a summer house. Who do you honestly think they are going to believe?" I looked at her standing out there in the heat, convinced she had just outsmarted me with a single phone call. She truly believed her social status, and her carefully crafted lies were an impenetrable shield. She thought I would panic. She thought I would unlock the door and surrender just to avoid a humiliating public scene with the police. But Evelyn did not realize she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to permanently destroy her control over my life. I did not want to simply kick her off the porch anymore. I wanted her to break in. I wanted Garrett to walk through that door. I wanted to catch all of them crossing an undeniable legal line so they could never gaslight me or the rest of the world ever again. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the window. "You are right, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous whisper. "Let us see exactly what the authorities have to say about this." I turned my back on her and walked away from the window, disappearing into the depths of my house. I did not go to the kitchen to panic. I went straight to my home office to prepare for war. I spent the next 2 hours inside my home office making a series of very specific phone calls and ensuring my security network was fully operational. Once the digital perimeter of my house was locked down, I realized I needed a change of scenery and a fresh shot of espresso. I left the cottage through the secure back entrance and took a short walk toward the harbor. I found a quiet, shaded table on the outdoor patio of a popular local cafe. I opened my laptop and began reviewing a preliminary catalog for an upcoming estate auction in Newport. The ocean breeze was cool and the hum of vacationers was relaxing. That piece lasted exactly 20 minutes. A sudden shadow fell across my keyboard, blocking the afternoon sun. I did not even have to look up to know who it was. The heavy scent of Garrett's expensive and overbearing cologne arrived before he did. He did not say hello, and he did not ask for permission to join me. He simply grabbed the wrought iron chair opposite mine and dragged it across the concrete patio with a loud, aggressive scrape. He dropped his large frame into the seat and leaned heavily onto the small table. He had finally changed out of his sweat-stained polo shirt, but his face was still flushed a deep, mottled red. The patronizing family man facade he usually wore around my mother was completely gone. His eyes were hard and his jaw was clenched tight. He was looking at me not as a sister-in-law, but as a subordinate who had dared to step out of line. "You think you are incredibly smart, do you not?" Tessa Garrett began, his voice low and dripping with condescension. "You think buying that house makes you untouchable?" I kept my hands resting calmly on my laptop keyboard. "I am simply enjoying my afternoon coffee, Garrett," I replied. "If you are here to ask for the keys again, my answer has not changed." He let out a short, humorless laugh and shook his head. "Oh, I am far past asking nicely," he sneered. "Evelyn might be willing to stand on your porch and beg, but I do not beg. I do not negotiate with people who operate below my level." I spent the last hour at the rental house making a few phone calls to my legal team back in Boston. "I also pulled the public records on your little real estate purchase." I raised an eyebrow, feigning mild curiosity, but internally I was highly amused. "Please enlighten me," I said. Garrett leaned closer, his voice dropping into a threatening whisper. "You are in way over your head. You bought a historic property in the Inkwell district. Those gingerbread cottages are protected by incredibly strict preservation bylaws and local zoning ordinances. I had my guys look into the recent renovations the previous owner did right before you bought it, specifically the installation of that massive central air conditioning unit and the expansion of the mahogany front porch." He paused, clearly waiting for me to look panicked. When I simply took a sip of my espresso, he pressed harder. "According to the Oak Bluffs Historical Commission, those modifications violate the original structural footprint." Garrett lied smoothly. "There is a massive zoning loophole in your deed, and as a concerned citizen of this community, I am fully prepared to file a formal grievance with the Town Planning Board and the Historical Society first thing tomorrow morning." I placed my ceramic cup back on its saucer. "You are threatening to report my house for zoning violations because I will not let you sleep in it?" I asked, clarifying his absurd position. "I am not threatening you, Tessa. I am giving you a reality check," he snapped, pointing a thick finger at my face. "Do you have any idea what happens when the Historical Commission opens an investigation? They will place an immediate injunction on the property. They will freeze the asset. You will not be able to live in it. You will not be able to sell it. You will not even be able to change a light bulb without written permission from a town committee." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a look of absolute triumph. "You will be forced to hire specialized preservation attorneys just to answer their daily emails. They charge $800 an hour. How long do you think your little junk-selling bank account can sustain that kind of burn rate? 3 months. Maybe 4. I stared at him, watching the sheer arrogance radiate from his pores. Garrett was a corporate middle manager who relied entirely on his family's trust fund to maintain his lifestyle. He was trying to intimidate me using legal buzzwords he had probably just Googled on his phone while sitting in front of a rusty fan. What he fundamentally failed to realize was that as a high-end estate liquidator, I dealt with property deeds, historical societies, zoning laws, and probate attorneys every single day of my life. It was literally my profession to navigate complex asset transfers. His threat was completely toothless and legally impossible based on the expedited title insurance I had secured yesterday. But I did not tell him that. I knew that correcting him would only make him retreat and rethink his strategy. If I wanted to permanently remove him from my life, I needed him to feel powerful. I needed him to believe his intimidation tactics were working, so he would take the next fatal step. I slowly closed my laptop and looked down at the table, allowing a small, calculated frown to form on my face. "A town investigation could take years to resolve," I said, keeping my voice quiet to mimic concern. "Exactly," Garrett said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He smelled blood in the water. "I have the financial resources to keep you tied up in endless litigation until you are bankrupt. I will bury you in so much paperwork, you will have to sell that house at a massive loss just to pay your legal fees. You tried to play in the big leagues, Tessa, but you do not have the stamina or the capital to fight me." He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table. "You made a foolish, impulsive purchase to get back at your mother. But now you are dealing with me. And I do not lose." I looked up, meeting his arrogant gaze. "What exactly is it that you want, Garrett?" I asked, playing the role of the defeated woman perfectly. Garrett's smile widened into a full predatory grin. He reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded stack of printed papers. "I want you to sign these," he said, sliding the documents across the table until they stopped right in front of my hands. "It is a very simple solution to a very expensive problem." I looked down at the stack of papers resting on the wrought iron table between my espresso cup and my laptop. The top sheet had the words, "Temporary Property Management" and "Quitclaim Agreement," printed in a basic bold font. It looked exactly like a cheap template he had downloaded for free off a discount legal website. I did not reach out to touch it. I simply kept my hands folded in my lap and looked back up at his flushed face. "What exactly am I looking at, Garrett?" I asked, letting a small amount of carefully manufactured anxiety seep into my voice. He tapped the top page heavily with his index finger. "This is your lifeline, Tessa," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Since you are in clear violation of the Oak Bluffs historical zoning laws, the town is going to come after the deed holder. That is you. But if you sign this temporary quitclaim deed, you transfer the immediate legal liability to me. I will be listed as the primary property manager and the temporary custodian of the estate. My legal team back in Boston handles the historical commission on your behalf. We tie them up in corporate red tape so you do not have to pay a single dime in lawyer fees." I let my eyes widen slightly. I leaned forward, acting as if I was desperately clinging to his every word. "So you would take on all the legal risk?" I asked, making sure to sound incredibly naive. "Why would you do that for me after I locked you out of the house this morning?" Garrett offered a magnanimous and thoroughly fake smile. "Because you are family, Tessa. Evelyn is incredibly upset and Brianna is stressed out. I am a problem solver. That is what I do. I step in and fix the mess. Now, obviously, since I will be managing the property and dealing with the town inspectors on site, my family will need full access to the main house. We will move our things into the master suite today. You can stay in one of the smaller guest rooms while we sort this out. All you have to do is sign the bottom line, and I will make this entire nightmare go away." It was a breathtakingly audacious scam. He was actively trying to trick me into signing away the title of my multi-million-dollar property under the guise of protecting me from a completely fabricated zoning violation. It was not just manipulative, it was documented extortion. But if I called him out on his lies right there on the patio, he would simply grab the papers and deny everything. I needed him to commit to the lie fully and digitally. I reached out and gently pushed the paper stack back toward him. "I cannot sign a paper copy right here at a cafe, Garrett," I said, shaking my head nervously. "I need to read the fine print. Can you please email the digital files to me? I prefer to zoom in on my laptop screen to read legal documents. My vision gets a little blurry when I am stressed." Garrett let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes at my apparent incompetence. He pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket. "Fine, Tessa," he said, his thumbs flying across the screen. "I am sending the PDF files to your email right now, but I am giving you a strict deadline. I want those documents digitally signed and emailed back to me by 5 o'clock this evening. If I do not have your signature by then, I am making the phone call to the Historical Society tomorrow morning and washing my hands of you completely." A few seconds later, my phone vibrated silently on the table. A notification popped up showing a new email from Garrett's personal account with the subject line "Inkwell Property Management Agreement." Attached were the fraudulent files. I had him. I had the digital footprint, the timestamp, and the exact IP address of his extortion attempt, sitting perfectly preserved in my secure inbox. "I will look these over right now, Garrett," I promised, tapping the trackpad on my laptop. "Thank you for stepping in to help me." Garrett stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of his expensive linen jacket. He looked down at me with an expression of absolute smug superiority. He genuinely believed he had just outmaneuvered a foolish, helpless black woman who spent her days dusting off flea market antiques. "Take my advice, Tessa," he said, buttoning his coat. "Stick to appraising old teacups and let the professionals handle the complex real estate assets. We will see you at the house around 6 o'clock to unpack our luggage. Have the keys ready." He turned around and walked away from the cafe, striding with the unearned confidence of a man who thought he owned the world. I watched his broad shoulders disappear into the crowd of tourists along the harbor. As soon as he was completely out of sight, the manufactured anxiety on my face vanished. I opened the email he just sent and downloaded the attachments directly to my hard drive. I hurried back to the cottage, practically sprinting the last block. As soon as I was safely inside, I locked the door and sprinted to my home office. I pulled up the email Garrett had just sent me and downloaded the attachments to a secure flash drive. I then composed a new message attaching both the fraudulent contracts and a detailed summary of Garrett's verbal threats. I hit send, targeting the personal email address of Elias Vance. Elias was not just any attorney. He was a powerhouse in Boston property law and a close personal friend. I had met him 5 years ago during a complex estate liquidation, and we had been an unstoppable team ever since. I knew he was currently on a flight back from a conference in London, but I also knew he never turned off his phone. 10 minutes later, my cell phone buzzed. It was Elias. "Tell me this is a joke, Tessa," he said, his deep voice crackling slightly over the international connection. "Tell me your sister did not marry a man stupid enough to document his own extortion attempt." "It is very real, Elias," I replied, a genuine smile spreading across my face for the first time all day. "He wants me to sign over the title by 5 o'clock, or he will report me to the Historical Society for zoning violations that do not exist. My mother already called a local locksmith and booked an appointment to drill the front door. They are planning to move in by sunset." Elias let out a low whistle of sheer disbelief. "Well, Garrett just handed you a loaded gun, Tessa. The contracts he sent you are a spectacular mix of mail fraud, attempted extortion, and coercion. They hold absolutely zero legal weight, but the intent is undeniable. If they actually break that lock and enter the premises, they elevate this to felony breaking and entering." "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say," I replied, opening the bottom drawer of my desk. "What are our next steps?" "Do not sign a single thing," Elias instructed, his voice shifting into full lawyer mode. "Let them think they have won. I want you out of that house immediately. Do not confront them when the locksmith arrives. Let them break the seal. Once they are inside, they are officially trespassing. I land in Boston in 2 hours. I am going to charter a helicopter straight to Martha's Vineyard. Do you have eyes on the property?" I pulled out a small black remote control from the desk drawer. "Oh, I have eyes on everything, Elias." "Perfect," he said. "Call me the second they breach the door." I hung up the phone and walked into the center of the living room, aiming the remote control at the ceiling. I pressed a sequence of 4 buttons. Immediately, a soft, mechanical hum filled the air. When you deal in multi-million-dollar antique appraisals, security is not an afterthought. It is a fundamental requirement. Before I even finalized the purchase of the cottage, I had Julian's security contacts install a state-of-the-art hidden surveillance system. Tiny high-definition cameras equipped with audio recording capabilities were discreetly embedded in the crown molding of every major room. The system was designed to protect the 18th century French porcelain I planned to store here, but today it was going to serve a much more satisfying purpose. I opened the security app on my phone and watched as the live feeds from the foyer, the living room, the kitchen, and the master bedroom popped onto the screen in crystal clear high definition. The audio was so sensitive I could hear the ocean waves crashing outside. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom and quickly packed a small overnight bag. I threw in a change of clothes, my laptop, and my essential toiletries. I wanted the house to look as if I had fled in a panic. I left my coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter. I left a book open on the living room sofa. I wanted them to walk in and think their intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. I slipped out the back door, locking it securely behind me. I walked down the narrow alleyway behind the cottage, completely avoiding the front street where Evelyn was likely still lurking. I made my way to the ferry terminal and bought a ticket for the next boat to the mainland. I did not actually plan on leaving the area, but I needed to be off the property and completely out of sight. I found a quiet corner in a small tavern near the docks, ordered a sparkling water, and set my phone flat on the wooden table. I opened the security app and maximized the grid view. The clock on the screen read 4:15. The locksmith was due to arrive any minute. I took a sip of my water, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and cold anticipation. For 35 years, I had been forced to shrink myself to accommodate their egos. I had swallowed their insults and accepted their scraps. But today, the dynamic was shifting permanently. They were about to walk blindly into a trap they had built entirely with their own arrogance, and I was going to watch every single second of their downfall. I had taken the quick Cape Air commuter flight from the island directly to Boston Logan Airport to meet Elias. By 4:45, I was sitting in the plush leather guest chair of his downtown corner office. The sprawling Boston skyline stretched out behind his mahogany desk, but my eyes were completely glued to the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on his conference room wall. I had cast my phone screen to the display so we could both watch the live security feeds in larger-than-life high definition. Elias sat next to me with a legal pad and a silver pen resting on the glass table. At exactly 4:50, the motion sensors on the front porch camera triggered a bright red alert on the monitor. "Here we go," Elias said, leaning forward and tapping the end of his pen against the legal pad. I watched the screen as Evelyn, Brianna, and Garrett marched up the wooden steps of my pristine porch. They were followed closely by a scruffy-looking man carrying a heavy metal toolbox. He was not wearing a uniform, and his battered work van parked on the street lacked any official company branding. He looked exactly like an off-the-books contractor who asked absolutely zero questions as long as he was handed cold, hard cash. The audio feed kicked in perfectly, capturing the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves and the heavy footsteps of the intruders. "This is the door," Evelyn said, pointing a manicured finger at my solid oak entryway. She turned to the locksmith, putting on her helpless grandmother routine once again. "We are just so exhausted. Please get us inside as quickly as you can. My poor daughter has been practically in tears all afternoon over losing the keys to our new family home." The locksmith barely looked at her. He dropped his heavy toolbox onto the mahogany floorboards with a loud thud that made me wince. He inspected the heavy brass deadbolt for a few seconds before pulling out a massive commercial-grade power drill. "Will that damage the door frame?" Garrett asked, stepping forward with his hands on his hips. He was trying to sound authoritative, but he just sounded nervous. "I am the property manager, and I do not want to deal with expensive repair bills because you slipped with a power tool." "I am not going to slip," the locksmith grunted, completely unimpressed by Garrett and his fake corporate title. "But I have to drill straight through the cylinder to break the internal pins. The lock is going to be completely destroyed. You will need to install a new one." "Just do it," Brianna whined, fanning herself with a folded magazine. "It is 1,000 degrees out here. I just want to get into the air conditioning and unpack my clothes." Elias let out a low, dry chuckle in the conference room. He began writing down timestamps on his legal pad, documenting every single second of the interaction. "Your brother-in-law is a special kind of stupid," Elias noted without taking his eyes off the screen. "He is actively directing the destruction of private property on camera." On the monitor, the locksmith raised the heavy drill and pressed the titanium bit directly into the center of my brass deadbolt. The screeching sound of metal tearing into metal echoed loudly through the conference room speakers. I watched as sharp metallic shavings fell onto my welcome mat. For a brief second, a wave of profound violation washed over me. This cottage was my sanctuary. It was the first physical space I had ever owned that was entirely mine, untouched by my family and their toxic demands. Watching them physically break into it felt deeply personal. But that fleeting sting of violation was quickly replaced by a massive surge of adrenaline. They were crossing a line they could never uncross. It took the locksmith exactly 3 minutes to completely hollow out the lock. He pulled the drill back and used a heavy flathead screwdriver to pop the ruined mechanism out of the door frame. The heavy brass cylinder clattered loudly onto the wooden porch. He turned the handle and pushed. The heavy solid oak door swung open, revealing the cool, dark interior of my magnificent foyer. A collective sigh of relief came from Evelyn, Brianna, and Garrett. The rush of central air conditioning hit them, and they practically shoved past the locksmith to get inside. "Wait right there," the locksmith called out, holding out a grease-stained hand. "That will be $350 for the emergency service call and the drill out. Cash only, just like we agreed on the phone." Evelyn did not even hesitate. She eagerly unzipped her designer leather bag, pulled out a thick envelope, and handed him 4 crisp $100 bills. "Keep the change," she said, waving him away dismissively. The locksmith pocketed the money, picked up his heavy toolbox, and walked down the steps without looking back. Garrett reached out and grabbed the brass door handle. He pulled the heavy oak door shut behind them, sealing the three of them completely inside my home. The camera feed from the porch went quiet, but the motion sensors inside the foyer, living room, and kitchen immediately lit up the grid on Elias's monitor. Elias placed his silver pen down on the glass table and looked over at me with a sharp, predatory smile. "Well, Tessa," he said, his voice ringing with absolute legal certainty. "They just paid a vendor with untraceable cash to destroy a security device and gain unauthorized entry into a private residence. They have officially crossed the legal threshold for felony breaking and entering. They are currently trespassing on your property." I stared at the screen, watching Brianna spin around in the center of my foyer, looking up at my crystal chandelier with pure, greedy joy. "They think they have won," I said quietly. "They think I ran away because I was terrified of Garrett's fake zoning laws." "Good," Elias replied, picking up his cell phone. "Let them get comfortable. Let them touch your things. Every single item they move adds another layer to the property damage and civil liability charges. I am going to call the Oak Bluffs Police Department right now and speak directly to the shift commander. I have a very good relationship with the local deputies on the island. We are going to arrange a highly coordinated police escort back to your house." I leaned back in the plush leather chair, watching my family wander through my multi-million-dollar property on the hidden cameras. They were smiling and laughing, completely unaware that they had just locked themselves inside their own digital prison. The live camera feeds on the conference room monitor captured every single movement with terrifying clarity. I watched from Boston as the three people who were supposed to be my family completely violated the sanctuary I had built for myself. They moved through my home with an arrogant sense of ownership, acting as if my belongings were merely obstacles in their way. Garrett was the first to make himself comfortable. He dropped his heavy duffel bag right onto the pristine entryway rug and walked directly into my chef's kitchen. He began opening cabinets and pulling out drawers, searching for supplies. When he spotted the custom-built wine refrigerator tucked under the marble island, his eyes lit up. I had just stocked that refrigerator the previous afternoon with several highly valuable bottles I had acquired from a private estate liquidation. Garrett bypassed the everyday table wine and immediately reached for the top shelf. He pulled out a 1982 Bordeaux. It was a rare vintage valued at well over $500. Garrett did not even bother to search my kitchen drawers for a proper corkscrew. He marched back to his duffel bag in the foyer and pulled out a cheap plastic bottle opener. I watched in absolute horror as he aggressively drilled the metal spiral into the fragile decades-old cork. He yanked it upward, causing half of the dry cork to crumble and fall directly into the expensive liquid. He did not care. He grabbed an everyday water glass from the dish rack, poured the contaminated vintage wine to the brim, and took a massive gulp. Elias let out a sharp breath next to me. He wrote the year and estimated value of the wine on his legal pad, drawing a thick line underneath it. "Theft and consumption of private property." Elias murmured, his pen moving rapidly. "This just keeps getting better." I shifted my focus to the camera feed covering the second floor. Brianna had dragged her heavy designer steamer trunks up the hardwood stairs and right into the center of my master bedroom. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands on her hips, surveying my personal space with blatant disgust. "Tessa has her junk spread out everywhere," Brianna yelled down the stairs, her shrill voice echoing through the house. "I have absolutely no room to hang my evening wear." Brianna did not look for an empty closet down the hall. She marched directly into my custom walk-in wardrobe. I watched the screen as she began violently yanking my clothes off their velvet hangers. These were not cheap department store garments. I am a high-end estate appraiser, and my closet was filled with pristine vintage silk dresses, tailored designer blazers, and one-of-a-kind European couture pieces that I had spent years sourcing. She did not carefully fold them. She crumpled the delicate fabrics into tight balls. When her arms were full, she marched downstairs to my kitchen, pulled a roll of heavy-duty black trash bags from under the sink, and marched right back up to the master suite. She aggressively shoved thousands of dollars of irreplaceable inventory into the garbage bags. I watched her perfectly manicured hands rip the delicate lace collar of a vintage Chanel blouse as she forced it into the black plastic. When the first bag was full, she dragged it roughly across the hardwood floor and kicked it out into the hallway. She then went back for more, clearing out half my wardrobe in mere minutes, just to make room for her fast fashion sundresses. While Brianna was destroying my closet, Evelyn was busy redecorating the main floor. I switched the primary monitor view back to the living room. My mother was standing near the large bay windows, loudly criticizing the antique furniture I had carefully curated for the space. "This layout is completely atrocious," Evelyn muttered to herself, shaking her head. "It feels like a dusty museum. We cannot possibly host Garrett's family in a room that looks like this." She walked over to a delicate 18th-century French side table that featured hand-painted porcelain inlays. It was one of my most prized possessions. Instead of carefully lifting the piece, Evelyn simply placed her hands on the edge and shoved it with all her body weight. The sharp wooden legs scraped loudly against my newly refinished heart pine floors. The screeching sound of the wood gouging the floorboards made my stomach drop. She pushed the antique table completely across the room, leaving a deep, visible scratch spanning 10 feet across the honey-colored wood. She did not stop there. Evelyn moved to my vintage mahogany credenza, dragging it against the wall to a completely different position. She shoved my linen sofa to the left and aggressively tossed my decorative silk pillows onto the floor. Every scrape, every thud, and every dismissive comment echoed perfectly through the hidden microphones. She was acting as the supreme matriarch, dictating the aesthetic of a house she did not own, while simultaneously causing thousands of dollars in property damage. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair watching my family dismantle my life. There was a time when seeing them discard my things would have broken my heart. It would have sent me into a spiral of trying to prove my worth to them. But sitting in that Boston high-rise with a top-tier attorney by my side, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, sharp clarity. They were giving me every piece of evidence I needed to sever our ties permanently. Elias checked his gold wristwatch and closed his legal pad with a loud snap. "The police shift commander just confirmed our timeline," Elias said, standing up from the conference table. "We have a private chopper waiting for us at the downtown helipad right now. The flight to the island takes exactly 40 minutes. By the time we land and meet the deputies at the perimeter, your family will have racked up enough felony damage to guarantee a very long evening in handcuffs." I looked at the monitor one last time before grabbing my overnight bag. Garrett was now sitting on my custom linen sofa with his dirty shoes resting directly on my antique coffee table, still drinking my stolen wine. Brianna was tossing the last of my vintage shoes into a garbage bag. And Evelyn, having finished destroying the living room floor, was now wandering down the hallway. I watched her stop in front of the closed door to my home office. She placed her hand on the brass knob and turned it, stepping into the room where I kept my most sensitive professional and financial files. "It is time to go," I told Elias, turning away from the screen. "Let us go introduce them to the real world." Evelyn stepped into my home office and immediately closed the solid wood door behind her, sealing herself inside. She stood in the center of the room for a moment, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the heavy antique mahogany desk. I watched the live feed from Boston as her eyes darted around the space. She was not there to admire the architecture. She was on a mission. Garrett had convinced her that I was hiding a fatal flaw in my paperwork, and Evelyn was determined to find the proof that my success was entirely fabricated. She marched directly behind my desk and dropped her designer bag onto the floor. She did not hesitate to invade my privacy. She grabbed the brass handle of the top drawer and yanked it open. When she found only pens and stationery, she slammed it shut and moved to the next one. She pulled out stacks of my confidential appraisal notes and carelessly tossed them onto the pristine surface of the desk. She was frantically searching for a property deed, a lease agreement, or any document she could weaponize against me to justify their hostile takeover of my cottage. She finally reached the large bottom filing drawer. I had left it unlocked earlier that afternoon. Evelyn pulled it open, and her eyes immediately locked onto a thick black leather portfolio resting at the very front. It was an impressive-looking binder embossed with the gold logo of my primary holding company. Evelyn let out a triumphant little gasp. She clearly believed she had just discovered the master file for the Martha's Vineyard property. She hauled the heavy portfolio out of the drawer, slammed it onto the desk, and flipped the leather cover open. I leaned closer to the monitor in Elias's conference room. The high-definition camera mounted directly above the desk gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of the documents. The microphone picked up the rustling of the heavy parchment paper. "Let us see exactly how much debt you are really hiding," Tessa Evelyn muttered to herself, her voice dripping with malicious anticipation. She turned the first page. She did not find a property deed for the cottage. Instead, she found a highly classified corporate acquisition summary. A few months prior, my estate liquidation firm had been hired to dissolve the assets of a massive failing financial conglomerate. During that process, I had the opportunity to purchase several smaller subsidiaries at a fraction of their market value. One of those subsidiaries was a boutique debt collection agency based in Georgia called Apex Financial Holdings. They specialized in buying up high-risk secondary mortgages and defaulted personal loans. I bought the entire agency and absorbed its massive portfolio into my own LLC. Evelyn ran her manicured finger down the list of acquired assets on the first page, her brow furrowed in confusion. This was not a simple real estate contract. It was a complex web of financial debt transfers. She turned to the second page, which listed the most heavily distressed accounts in the Georgia portfolio. I watched her finger stop abruptly near the middle of the page. The microphone caught the sharp intake of her breath. It was a loud, ragged gasp that echoed clearly through the Boston office. Evelyn leaned closer to the paper, her nose almost touching the desk. She began to read the line item out loud, her voice trembling violently. Primary debtor. Evelyn Vance. She whispered the words, barely escaping her throat. Property address: 421 Magnolia Lane, Atlanta, Georgia. Second mortgage principal balance $180,000. Notice of default pending. She froze, completely paralyzed by the words on the page. 2 years ago, Brianna had demanded an extravagant destination wedding in Tuscany. Garrett's family had refused to contribute a single dime, claiming it was the bride's traditional responsibility to foot the bill. Evelyn, desperate to maintain the illusion of unlimited wealth and desperate to please her favorite child, had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on her primary residence in Atlanta to pay for the lavish event. She had spent the last 24 months drowning in the interest payments, quietly defaulting on the loan, while continuing to project an image of absolute financial superiority. The bank had eventually sold her toxic debt to Apex Financial Holdings, and I had just bought Apex. Current holding entity. Evelyn read, her voice cracking as she traced the final column of the spreadsheet. She swallowed hard, reading the name of the sole proprietor out loud. Tessa Vance. The reality of her situation slammed into her with the force of a freight train. The malicious triumph that had animated her face just moments ago completely evaporated. Her skin turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. Her hands began to shake so violently that the heavy parchment paper rattled against the mahogany wood. She was not just standing in my house illegally. She was not just tearing apart my belongings and insulting my career. She was standing in the home of the woman who quite literally owned the roof over her head in Atlanta. The daughter she had systematically financially abused and gaslit her entire life was now the primary lien holder of her most valuable asset. She realized in that exact horrifying second that I did not need a zoning law or a phony contract to destroy her. I simply needed to make one phone call to initiate a total foreclosure on her home and leave her completely destitute. Oh my God! Evelyn breathed, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She stumbled backward away from the desk, her legs suddenly refusing to support her weight. She collided with the leather office chair and collapsed into it, staring at the black portfolio as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She had spent her entire life controlling the narrative and controlling the money. Now she had absolutely nothing. She was completely at my mercy, and she knew exactly how much mercy she had shown me over the years. 0. I looked away from the monitor and met Elias's gaze. He was smiling a sharp, dangerous smile. He reached over and tapped the power button on the remote, shutting off the screen. We had seen everything we needed to see. The trap had not just closed around them, it had locked permanently. "Grab your bag, Tessa," Elias said, throwing his suit jacket over his shoulder. "Your mother just realized she is entirely bankrupt, and your brother-in-law is currently destroying a $500 bottle of wine. I think it is time we go home and ask them how they are enjoying their vacation." I picked up my leather tote bag and walked out of the Boston office, the absolute certainty of my victory carrying me every step of the way to the helipad. Elias and I landed at the Martha's Vineyard airport just as the late afternoon sun began casting long golden shadows across the island. A black SUV was waiting for us on the tarmac arranged by Elias during the flight. We drove directly to the Oak Bluffs police station, where Deputy Jenkins, a no-nonsense officer Elias had known for years, was waiting by his cruiser. Elias quickly briefed him on the situation, showing him the timestamps of the video footage and the fraudulent contracts Garrett had emailed me. Jenkins did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply nodded, got into his cruiser, and told us to follow him. When our SUV pulled onto Inkwell Beach Road, the neighborhood was quiet. Garrett's black rental car was still parked halfway down the block, dragging that ridiculous utility trailer. My coral and white gingerbread cottage looked peaceful from the outside, but I knew exactly what was happening inside. We parked silently behind the police cruiser. Jenkins stepped out, adjusting his heavy utility belt, and walked up my front steps. He noticed the brass shavings on the welcome mat and the destroyed lock cylinder immediately. He looked back at Elias and me, giving a single sharp nod. He reached out and pushed the heavy oak door open. I stepped into my own foyer, flanked by a high-powered Boston attorney and an armed, uniformed deputy. The silence that hit the house was absolute and deafening. Garrett was the first to react. He had been sitting on my linen sofa holding the glass of my stolen Bordeaux wine. When he saw the police uniform, his body physically jolted, spilling the dark red liquid down the front of his clean shirt and onto the pale fabric of my couch. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. He scrambled to his feet, his face instantly draining of color. Brianna appeared at the top of the stairs holding another one of my expensive vintage blouses. She took one look at Deputy Jenkins, froze completely, and dropped the silk garment over the banister. And then Evelyn emerged from the hallway. She looked as though she had seen a ghost. Her skin was still that sickly gray color from reading the financial portfolio, and her hands were visibly trembling. She clutched the doorframe of the hallway, staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and complete disbelief. She had expected to have the entire house unpacked and claimed by the time the sun went down. She never expected me to return, let alone with a tactical strike team. "Well," Elias said, his deep voice cutting through the thick silence like a knife, "it certainly looks like you all made yourselves right at home." Garrett immediately threw his hands up in the air, stepping backward away from the broken glass and the spilled wine. "Officer, there has been a massive misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice pitching up an octave in pure panic. "We have permission to be here. I am the designated property manager." Deputy Jenkins did not flinch. He rested his hand casually on his radio. "Property manager," he repeated, his tone flat and unimpressed. "That is interesting, because the actual property owner standing right here told me she never gave you keys. The destroyed lock on the front door tells the exact same story." Garrett's eyes darted frantically between Jenkins and me. He swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Tessa, tell him," Garrett pleaded, pointing a shaking finger at me. Tell him we talked at the cafe. I sent you the management contracts. You agreed to let us stay here while I sorted out the zoning issues with the Historical Commission. I crossed my arms and stared at him, letting the absolute pathetic nature of his lie hang in the air. I did not agree to anything, Garrett. I said, my voice ice cold. You tried to extort me using fake zoning laws. You demanded I sign over my title. When I refused, you hired a locksmith off the books to destroy my property and break into my home. That is a lie, Garrett shouted, taking a step forward before Jenkins held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. Evelyn told us she owned the house, Garrett yelled, completely throwing my mother under the bus without a second thought. She said she bought it. She told the locksmith she lost the keys. I was just trying to help my family move in. I had absolutely nothing to do with breaking that lock. Evelyn gasped, clutching her chest. Garrett, how dare you? She hissed, her voice raspy and weak. It is the truth, Evelyn, Garrett yelled back, his face turning red again. You set me up. You told me this was a family asset. Elias stepped forward, pulling a folded printed document from his suit jacket. It was a physical copy of the email Garrett had sent me. That is a fascinating defense, Garrett, Elias said smoothly. But it completely contradicts the written contract you emailed my client at 4:15 this afternoon, explicitly stating you were taking over management of her specific asset. You cannot claim Evelyn owned it while simultaneously trying to coerce Tessa into signing the deed over to you. That is documented extortion coupled with felony breaking and entering. Garrett stared at the paper in Elias's hand, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He realized his digital footprint had trapped him completely. Deputy Jenkins pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket. So who exactly hired the locksmith? Jenkins asked, looking directly at Evelyn. Evelyn swallowed hard, leaning heavily against the wall. Officer, please, she said, trying to summon her helpless grandmother routine one last time. This is just a silly family dispute. Passions ran a little high. My daughter has always been very dramatic. We were just trying to get the toddlers out of the heat. We will pay for the broken lock right now and be on our way. Jenkins looked at the shattered glass on the floor, the wine soaking into the sofa, and the trash bags full of clothes visible at the top of the stairs. This looks a lot more expensive than a broken lock, ma'am, he said grimly. Tessa, please, Evelyn whispered, looking directly at me. Her eyes were begging. She knew about the debt. She knew about the portfolio. She knew she was completely trapped. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please do not do this to your family. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life minimizing my worth. I looked at the sister who had just thrown my career into garbage bags. I looked at the brother-in-law who had tried to steal my multi-million-dollar home. Deputy, I said, turning my attention solely to Jenkins. I would like to press full criminal charges against all three of them for breaking and entering destruction of private property and trespassing. The silence returned heavier and far more permanent than before. Deputy Jenkins unclipped the radio from his shoulder strap and brought it to his mouth. Dispatch. I am going to need 2 additional backup units at the Inkwell address for multiple transports. The reality of those words hit the foyer like a physical shockwave. Transports meant handcuffs. It meant the back of a police cruiser. It meant they were not going to talk their way out of this with their country club credentials. Garrett completely abandoned whatever shred of loyalty he had left for his wife's family. He lunged toward Deputy Jenkins but stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands raised in the air in a desperate gesture of surrender. You cannot arrest me, officer, he begged, his voice cracking. I am a senior vice president at a major financial firm. An arrest record will destroy my career. I am telling you, Evelyn orchestrated this entire thing. Check my phone right now. Check the call logs. She is the one who hired the locksmith. You just saw her hand the man the cash. I am just an innocent bystander trying to help my mother-in-law move into a house she swore she owned. Evelyn pressed her back against the hallway wall, looking as if she had just been physically struck. You cowardly little man, she hissed at him, all her previous admiration for his wealth instantly vanishing. You were the one waving around fake zoning laws all afternoon. Garrett did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the deputy, practically vibrating with fear. I only sent those emails because Evelyn told me Tessa was acting erratically and needed a firm hand. Arrest her. She is the mastermind here. She is the one who broke the law. While Garrett was aggressively throwing my mother to the wolves, Brianna was attempting a frantic and entirely pathetic cover-up on the second floor. From my position in the foyer, I could see her through the wooden slats of the staircase railing. She was using her foot to aggressively kick the heavy black trash bags full of my vintage clothing toward the master bathroom, trying to hide the evidence of her vandalism. The heavy plastic scraped loudly against the hardwood floors, echoing over Garrett's frantic pleading. "Ma'am, step away from those bags and come downstairs right now!" Deputy Jenkins ordered, his voice booming through the two-story space. Brianna froze, her foot still resting against a bulging trash bag. She plastered a completely fake, innocent smile on her face and leaned over the banister. "Oh, there is no problem up here, officer," she called down, her voice trembling violently. "I was just doing a little bit of tidying up. Tessa left a huge mess in the closet, and I was just gathering some old donations for charity. We are a very clean family." "Those are not donations, Brianna," I corrected her, my voice projecting clearly up the stairs. "Those are custom designer garments that you violently ripped off velvet hangers and shoved into garbage bags. And just to be completely clear, you did all of this on a high-definition surveillance camera. I watched you tear the lace on a $10,000 vintage Chanel blouse from a television monitor in Boston." Brianna's fake smile completely collapsed. She looked up at the ceiling molding, frantically searching for the hidden cameras, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She slowly backed away from the trash bags and began descending the stairs, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the wooden handrail with both hands just to stay upright. Evelyn, seeing her favorite child trembling in fear, and her wealthy son-in-law begging for mercy, realized her entire empire was crumbling into dust. The vicious, manipulative woman who had just read her own financial ruin in my office disappeared. In her place, a sweet, confused, and deeply concerned grandmother suddenly materialized. She stepped away from the wall and moved toward Deputy Jenkins, offering him a gentle, matriarchal smile. "Officer Jenkins, surely we can approach this with a little bit of common sense," she said, her voice soft and soothing. "You must have better things to do than arrest a family on their summer vacation. This is simply a silly misunderstanding between two sisters. Tessa has always been a deeply emotional girl. She is just acting out because we unfortunately did not have enough room for her in our original rental house. She bought this place in a manic episode, and we were just coming inside to check on her well-being. We were terrified she might hurt herself." She reached out as if to gently pat the deputy on the arm, but Jenkins immediately stepped backward, placing a firm hand on his utility belt. "Do not touch me, ma'am," Jenkins warned, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. Evelyn quickly pulled her hand back, but maintained her saccharine smile. "We are a good family," she insisted, looking at Elias for support. "We will happily pay for the broken lock and the cleaning bill for the spilled wine. There is absolutely no need to involve the courts in a private family health crisis. Tessa is just throwing a tantrum, and we are perfectly willing to forgive her for wasting your time." Elias stepped right into Evelyn's line of sight, towering over her. "You are not going to gaslight your way out of felony charges, Evelyn," he stated, his voice radiating absolute authority. "You did not break in to perform a wellness check. You broke in because you wanted to steal a multi-million-dollar asset. You caused catastrophic damage to a historic heart pine floor. You illegally consumed a $500 bottle of rare vintage wine. And you destroyed thousands of dollars in irreplaceable vintage couture. The property damage alone upgrades this from a simple misdemeanor to a high-level felony." Evelyn's sweet mother facade shattered completely. She turned her furious gaze toward me. "You are a monster, Tessa," she spat, her true colors finally bleeding through the panic. "You set a trap for your own flesh and blood. You purposefully left the house empty just to ruin our lives." "I did not set a trap, Evelyn," I replied, holding my ground. "I simply bought a house. You built the trap. You set the trap. And then you gleefully walked right into it because you believed you were entirely untouchable. I am just the person who finally locked the door behind you." The wail of police sirens suddenly pierced the quiet coastal air, growing louder by the second. The backup units had arrived. Garrett dropped his head into his hands and began to quietly sob. Brianna sat down heavily on the bottom step of the staircase, burying her face in her knees. Evelyn stood frozen in the center of my magnificent foyer, trapped in the terrifying reality that her reign of terror was officially over. The flashing red and blue lights of the backup police cruisers swept across the large bay windows of my living room, painting the shocked faces of my family in alternating colors. Heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden porch steps as two additional uniformed officers entered the foyer, flanking Deputy Jenkins. Garrett was practically hyperventilating on the sofa while Brianna rocked back and forth on the bottom stair. Evelyn remained entirely mute. Her eyes darted toward the open front door as if she were calculating the odds of simply running past the police and disappearing into the night. But there was nowhere to run. Deputy Jenkins turned his attention back to me and pulled a digital voice recorder from his utility belt. He pressed the red record button. "Ms. Vance, you stated you have video evidence of the break-in and the subsequent property damage," Jenkins said, his voice strictly professional. "I need to verify that footage before we proceed with the transports." I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I did not just have a short video clip. I had a multi-angle high-definition documentary of their absolute entitlement. I tapped the screen and opened my encrypted security application. I turned the volume all the way up and held the large screen out so Deputy Jenkins, the two backup officers, and my entire family could see it perfectly. "Let us start with the porch," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. I pressed play on the first saved file. The crystal-clear video filled the screen, showing the four of them standing outside my front door earlier that afternoon. The audio was flawless, picking up the sound of the ocean and the exact words spoken. We all watched as Evelyn put on her helpless grandmother routine, begging the locksmith to let them inside. We watched the locksmith explicitly warn them that the lock would be permanently destroyed. And then the audio captured Garrett's arrogant voice booming from the tablet speakers. "I am the property manager. Just do it." I paused the video right as Evelyn handed the man 4 crisp $100 bills. I looked over at Garrett, who was staring at the screen with wide, bloodshot eyes. "As you can see, Deputy," I noted calmly, "my mother paid the contractor in untraceable cash. And my brother-in-law explicitly authorized the destruction of the deadbolt. Neither of them were performing a wellness check. They were orchestrating an illegal entry, and they paid for it together." Deputy Jenkins nodded, his jaw set tight. He looked back at Garrett. "That is a direct contradiction to the statement you gave me 2 minutes ago," Sir Jenkins noted. "Lying to a sworn officer during an active investigation will be added to your charges." Garrett opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He simply slumped further into the ruined fabric of the linen sofa. I tapped the screen again, swiping to the second saved file. "Now let us review the property damage upstairs," I said. The video switched to the camera mounted inside my custom walk-in closet. The high-definition lens captured Brianna marching into the space and violently yanking my vintage garments off their velvet hangers. The pristine audio playback filled the silent foyer with the sickening sound of delicate silk and antique lace ripping apart. Everyone watched as Brianna balled up a one-of-a-kind European couture dress and aggressively shoved it into a black garbage bag. She looked directly into the camera lens. At one point, her face twisted in a mask of petty, vindictive rage. Brianna let out a high-pitched whimper from her spot on the stairs and buried her face deeper into her knees. She could not even bear to look at the screen. "Those items are not easily replaced," Elias chimed in, standing tall beside me. "We are looking at a minimum of $30,000 in destroyed inventory in that closet alone. And that does not even factor in the $500 bottle of wine her husband drank, or the antique French side table Evelyn deliberately gouged into the living room floor." The two backup officers exchanged a serious look. The sheer dollar amount of the destruction easily pushed the crime into the territory of a major felony. They shifted their weight, placing their hands on their duty belts. I swiped to the final piece of evidence. And finally I said, locking eyes with my mother, "I want to show you exactly what my mother was doing while Brianna was destroying my wardrobe." The screen shifted to my home office. Evelyn watched herself on the tablet, her face completely blank. The video showed her marching behind my mahogany desk and ripping open the drawers. It showed her frantically throwing my confidential appraisal notes onto the desk surface. And then it showed her finding the black leather portfolio. The audio picked up her malicious whisper as she prepared to expose my financial secrets. "Let us see exactly how much debt you are really hiding, Tessa." Her recorded voice echoed through the foyer. I paused the video right as Evelyn's face drained of color upon discovering she was the one in massive debt to me. "She was looking for my property deed, deputy," I explained, holding the tablet steady. "She was actively searching for legal documents to steal so they could justify squatting in my home. She invaded my private office and compromised confidential financial files. Her intent was entirely malicious from the very second she stepped onto this island." I tapped the screen one last time, shutting off the display and slipping the tablet back into my leather tote bag. The evidence had been presented. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for Evelyn to spin a narrative about family misunderstandings or emotional wellness checks. The cameras had captured the unvarnished truth of who they really were and how little they respected my autonomy. Deputy Jenkins took a slow, deep breath. He looked around the foyer, taking in the broken glass, the spilled wine, the trash bags on the landing, and the three terrified individuals who had finally reached the absolute limit of their privilege. He had seen everything he needed to see. The digital evidence was completely irrefutable. He gave a single firm nod to the two backup officers standing beside him, signaling them to move into position. Jenkins reached down to his heavy leather utility belt. The sharp metallic click of his handcuffs being unclasped echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor, and walked directly toward Garrett. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the exact sound that finally shattered Garrett's fragile reality. He was a man who had spent his entire life insulated by generational wealth and corporate titles. He genuinely believed that consequences were things that only happened to other people. But as Deputy Jenkins closed the distance between them, holding the heavy steel restraints, Garrett completely lost his mind. His fight or flight instinct hijacked his brain, and he made the single worst decision of his entire life. "I am not going to jail," Garrett screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic. He lowered his shoulder and lunged forward, attempting to shove his way past Deputy Jenkins. It was a pathetic, desperate move. Jenkins was a veteran officer who had anticipated the panic the moment Garrett started hyperventilating. Jenkins shifted his weight, dropping his center of gravity, and easily deflected Garrett's clumsy shove. The momentum sent Garrett stumbling wildly toward the open heavy oak front door. He burst through the entryway and onto my expansive mahogany porch, his expensive leather loafers slipping dangerously on the smooth wood. He was sprinting toward the porch stairs, blindly hoping to reach his rental car and escape. He did not even make it to the bottom step. The two backup officers, who had been standing just outside the threshold, reacted with absolute precision. One officer moved laterally, cutting off Garrett's escape route down the stairs, while the other lunged forward. The second officer grabbed Garrett by the shoulder of his wrinkled linen jacket and used Garrett's own forward momentum to sweep his legs completely out from under him. Garrett hit the ground with a sickening thud. He tumbled off the bottom step of the porch and landed face first in the center of my meticulously manicured front lawn. The crisp green grass cushioned his fall slightly, but the impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. He let out a loud, wheezing gasp as the two officers descended upon him. "Stop resisting, and put your hands behind your back," the officer shouted, pressing his knee firmly between Garrett's shoulder blades. "I am a vice president." Garrett sobbed, his face pressed directly into the dirt. "My father is a partner at his law firm. You are going to lose your jobs. I will sue this entire island." His threats were completely useless. The officers efficiently pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp ratcheting sound of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed across the quiet neighborhood street. They hauled him to his feet, his expensive clothes stained with grass and dirt, his face red and streaked with tears. The arrogant man who had tried to extort me just a few hours earlier at the cafe was now a weeping criminal. Being frog-marched toward the back of a police cruiser. Inside the foyer, the sight of Garrett being tackled sent Brianna into an absolute spiral of hysteria. The golden child, who had never faced a single hardship in her 32 years of life, completely broke down. She let out a blood-curdling scream and practically collapsed onto the hardwood floor. She scrambled away from the open front door, crawling backward on her hands and knees until her back hit the staircase banister. She pulled her knees up to her chest, sobbing so violently her entire body shook. "Mom, you have to stop them!" Brianna shrieked, her voice echoing painfully in the two-story space. "Do not let them take him. Who is going to pay our bills? Who is going to pay my credit cards? Call his father right now. Fix this, Mom. You have to fix this right now." She reached out a trembling hand toward our mother, waiting for Evelyn to perform her usual magic. Brianna was waiting for the woman who had always shielded her from consequence to step forward and make the bad things go away. But Evelyn did not move. She stood perfectly frozen in the center of my foyer. Her designer bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a dull thud. Her eyes were locked on the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the living room windows, but she was not really seeing them. She was staring into the absolute void of her own ruined future. "Mom," Brianna screamed again, her voice growing raspy and desperate. "Why are you just standing there? Do something. Tell them I did not mean to ruin the clothes. Tell them we will buy Tessa a new wardrobe. Please, Mom." Evelyn slowly turned her head and looked down at her favorite child. The expression on my mother's face was entirely hollow. There was no warmth, no fierce protection, and no calculating strategy left in her eyes. The financial portfolio she had read in my office had completely stripped her of her power. She knew she had zero leverage. She could not buy Brianna a new wardrobe because she did not even own the house she slept in back in Atlanta. She was utterly bankrupt, both morally and financially. "I cannot fix it," Evelyn whispered, her voice so faint it barely carried over Brianna's sobbing. Brianna's eyes widened in sheer terror. "What do you mean you cannot fix it? You always fix it. You promised me this summer was going to be perfect." Evelyn did not answer. She slowly turned her gaze away from Brianna and looked directly at me. It was the first time in my entire life I had ever seen my mother look small. The towering matriarch who had dictated my worth and demanded my obedience was entirely gone. She was just a terrified aging woman waiting for the police to place her in handcuffs next. I stood tall beside Attorney Elias, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I did not offer her a sympathetic smile. I did not break eye contact. I simply watched the inevitable destruction of the toxic hierarchy she had built. The front lawn was secure, the golden child was shattered, and the architect of my childhood misery was finally out of moves. The commotion on my front lawn had not gone unnoticed. Inkwell Beach Road was a quiet enclave of generational wealth and deeply rooted social standing. The arrival of 3 police cruisers with their lights flashing had shattered that tranquility, pulling the neighborhood's attention directly to my front yard. As the officers hauled Garrett to his feet, reading him his Miranda rights in loud, clear voices, I noticed the movement on the surrounding properties. Doors were opening. The elite families of Oak Bluffs, the very people Evelyn had spent decades trying to impress and emulate, were stepping out onto their sprawling porches. I saw Mrs. Harrington, a prominent judge who hosted the island's most exclusive summer gala, standing at the edge of her lawn. Next door, Dr. and Mrs. Vance, respected philanthropists my mother had been desperately trying to secure dinner reservations with for years, were leaning over their white picket fence, watching the entire spectacle unfold. Evelyn noticed them too. Her head snapped toward the street, and a fresh wave of absolute horror washed over her face. She took a step toward the doorway, desperate to hide from the prying eyes of polite society, but Deputy Jenkins shifted his stance, blocking her path. "Garrett, please stop screaming," Evelyn hissed at him as the officers dragged him past the front steps. "You are making a scene." "I am making a scene," Garrett shrieked, his grass-stained face twisting in disbelief. "I am being arrested for a felony, Evelyn. Do something. Call my lawyer. Call someone." He continued to shout obscenities and threats as the officers deposited him into the back of a squad car, slamming the door shut and instantly cutting off his voice. The flashing lights illuminated the faces of the watching neighbors, locking the image of our family's disgrace into their memories forever. Evelyn's carefully constructed empire, built entirely on the illusion of superiority and refined elegance, was reduced to a trashy public arrest on a manicured lawn. Her social currency was completely bankrupt. She would never be invited to a gala on this island again. She would be the cautionary tale, the neighborhood gossip, the pariah. Deputy Jenkins turned his attention back to the foyer. He looked at Brianna, still weeping on the stairs, and then at Evelyn. "Ma'am," Jenkins said, addressing my mother, "you and your daughter are both accessories to breaking and entering, and you are both liable for the extensive property damage inside this home. The homeowner has elected to press charges. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Evelyn let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Tessa, please," she whispered, her voice devoid of any arrogance. "I am your mother. You cannot let them do this to me. Think of the family. Think of the scandal." I looked at the woman who had spent my life engineering my failure. "I am thinking of the family, Evelyn," I replied, my voice echoing in the quiet foyer. "I am thinking about how you decided I was not family simply because Garrett needed a place to store his golf clubs. I am thinking about how easily you conspired to steal from me because you believed I was beneath you. You built this scandal entirely on your own." Jenkins unclipped a second pair of handcuffs. Evelyn slowly turned around, her shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. The sharp metallic click echoed through the house, sealing her fate. Brianna, realizing her mother was now in custody, let out a fresh wail of despair, but the second backup officer quickly silenced her, hauling her up from the stairs and securing her wrists in steel. The golden child was finally facing a consequence she could not cry her way out of. The officers began marching Evelyn and Brianna toward the waiting cruisers. They were forced to walk, the perp walk, right past the judging eyes of the neighborhood elite. Evelyn kept her head down, her face burning with a humiliation she would never recover from. "Wait!" I called out, stepping onto the porch. The officers paused. Evelyn turned her head, a sudden spark of desperate hope igniting in her eyes. She genuinely thought I was about to call it off to forgive them and save her from the ultimate indignity. But I was not there to save her. I was there to deliver the final blow. Elias stepped forward, walking briskly down the porch steps until he was standing directly in front of my mother. He reached inside his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He held it out, extending it toward Evelyn's handcuffed wrists. When she could not take it, he calmly tucked it into the side pocket of her designer handbag, which was currently slung awkwardly over her shoulder. "What is that?" Evelyn whispered, the spark of hope dying instantly in her eyes. "That is a formal notice of debt acceleration," Elias stated, his voice loud enough for the watching neighbors to hear. "My client Tessa Vance has instructed my firm to initiate immediate collection procedures regarding the second mortgage on your primary residence at 421 Magnolia Lane in Atlanta." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. I stepped down the stairs, standing beside Elias. "You violated the law, Evelyn," I said, looking directly into her face. "You conspired to steal my property, and you destroyed my belongings. Because of your criminal actions, I am officially accelerating the terms of your defaulted loan. You have exactly 30 days to pay the remaining balance of $180,000 in full." She opened her eyes, staring at me in complete disbelief. "Tessa, I do not have that kind of money," she sobbed. "You know I do not. If you do this, I will lose the house. I will have nowhere to go. If you fail to produce the full amount within 30 days, I will initiate foreclosure proceedings." I continued, ignoring her pleas entirely. "The bank will seize the property, and it will be liquidated at auction." "You are destroying me!" Evelyn cried, struggling weakly against the officer's grip. "You are destroying your own mother." "No, Evelyn," I corrected her, turning my back and walking up the porch steps. "I am simply holding you accountable. You destroyed yourself." I walked into my grand foyer, the cool air conditioning washing over me. I stood beside the heavy oak door and looked out at the street one last time. Deputy Jenkins placed his hand on top of Evelyn's head, guiding her into the back of the cruiser. Brianna was loaded into the car behind her. The doors slammed shut. The engines roared to life, and the 3 police vehicles slowly pulled away from my property, carrying the toxic weight of my past away forever. I reached out and pulled the broken door shut. The lock was destroyed, but for the first time in 35 years I felt completely and utterly safe. I woke up the next morning to the gentle sound of seagulls and the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic Ocean against Inkwell Beach. The heavy oak door of my cottage had been temporarily secured with a heavy-duty padlock provided by the police, but the inside of my home was completely peaceful. I walked down the sweeping hardwood staircase wrapped in my plush white robe and headed straight for the kitchen. I brewed a fresh pot of Kona coffee and poured it into my favorite ceramic mug. I walked out onto my expansive mahogany porch and took a deep breath of the crisp, salty air. The chaotic nightmare of the previous evening felt like a distant memory. The morning sun was bright, and the neighborhood had returned to its quiet, dignified state. That peace was interrupted by the sound of a rattling engine. A battered island taxi pulled up to the curb directly in front of my house. The rear doors opened and 2 incredibly disheveled women stepped out onto the sidewalk. It was Evelyn and Brianna. They had spent the entire night in a holding cell at the Oak Bluffs police station. Their release had likely been delayed until the morning magistrate could process their bail for the property damage and trespassing charges. They looked absolutely ruined. Brianna was still wearing the same designer sundress from the day before, but it was completely wrinkled and stained with sweat and dirt. Her hair was a tangled, chaotic mess. Evelyn looked even worse. She was missing her designer sunglasses and her expensive wedge heels. She walked in flat sandals, looking every bit her actual age with deep, dark circles under her eyes and her posture entirely defeated. They did not march up the steps with their usual arrogant entitlement. They walked slowly, holding on to each other for support. They stopped at the bottom of my porch stairs, looking up at me as I casually sipped my coffee. Tessa Brianna croaked, her voice hoarse from hours of crying. "Please, you have to help us." I did not move from my comfortable wicker chair. I simply looked down at them, resting my coffee mug on my knee. "Where is the property manager?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathy. Brianna let out a pathetic sob, covering her face with her hands. "The magistrate denied Garrett bail," she wept. "He has previous financial flags on his record, and because he tried to run from the police, they deemed him a flight risk. They are transferring him to a county facility on the mainland. His corporate accounts have been frozen pending the criminal investigation." "And your luxury summer rental?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. The owner of the shack saw the arrest on the local island news. Evelyn whispered, staring at the ground. "He canceled the reservation and changed the locks." "We have nowhere to go, Tessa. Our credit cards are tied to Garrett's primary accounts and they are all declining. We do not even have enough cash to buy a ferry ticket back to Boston." They were completely stranded. The financial padding that had protected them their entire lives had been stripped away in a matter of hours. They were standing on the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs, facing the absolute reality of their own actions. "We are begging you," Brianna cried, dropping to her knees right there on the bottom step. "I am so sorry for what I did to your clothes. I was just so jealous of you. I have always been jealous of you. Please let us come inside, just for a few days until Garrett's father can wire us some money. We will sleep on the floor. We will do whatever you want. Just please do not leave us out here on the street." I looked at Brianna weeping on my stairs, and then I looked at Evelyn. My mother finally raised her head and met my eyes. She did not say a word. She knew that any manipulative trick or guilt trip she tried to deploy would instantly trigger the foreclosure of her Atlanta home. She was completely broken, and she was silently begging for the one thing she had never given me: mercy. For 35 years, they had demanded that I shrink myself to make them comfortable. They had ridiculed my career, drained my confidence, and attempted to steal my hard-earned sanctuary. And now they wanted me to save them from a disaster they had orchestrated entirely on their own. I stood up from my wicker chair and walked slowly over to the wooden porch railing, looking down at the two women. "I am sorry," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady in the morning air, "but I am currently organizing my inventory. I need the extra space for my antiques. There simply is not any room for you." Brianna gasped, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. It was the exact text message Evelyn had sent me to kick me out of the family reunion. I was feeding their own cruelty right back to them, word for perfect word. "Have a wonderful summer," I added. I turned my back on them and walked directly to my front door. I stepped inside the cool entryway and pulled the heavy door shut, closing the temporary padlock with a loud, decisive click. I did not look out the window. I did not care how long they sat on the curb or how they managed to get off the island. I had permanently severed the toxic anchor that had dragged me down my entire life. Fast forward 3 months. The sweltering heat of August had faded into a beautiful, crisp autumn. The island of Martha's Vineyard was quieter, but the sunsets were more spectacular than ever. A lot had changed since that chaotic afternoon. Garrett was indicted on multiple felony counts, including extortion fraud and breaking and entering. Because Elias had meticulously documented the digital trail, Garrett's high-priced lawyers could not negotiate a plea deal. He was currently sitting in a mainland jail awaiting a trial that would undoubtedly end in a lengthy prison sentence. The legal fees had completely drained Brianna's accounts. Without Garrett's corporate salary and with her own reputation destroyed, she was forced to move into a cheap apartment in a terrible neighborhood, constantly dodging calls from debt collectors. Evelyn's fate was equally severe. Exactly 30 days after I handed her the debt acceleration notice, my legal team filed the foreclosure paperwork. She tried to fight it, but the documentation was ironclad. The bank seized the massive Atlanta estate she had spent her life bragging about. She was forced to downsize to a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, far away from the country clubs and the elite social circles she prized above her own children. Meanwhile, my life had blossomed in ways I never thought possible. The air was cool and filled with the scent of roasted garlic and ocean salt. I was hosting an elegant, intimate dinner party on my sprawling inkwell porch. The mahogany table was covered with a crisp white linen cloth, set with my finest antique French porcelain and polished silver. Soft jazz music drifted through the open bay windows of my beautifully restored living room. I sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. Attorney Elias sat to my right, laughing loudly at a joke. Deputy Jenkins, who was off-duty and wearing a comfortable sweater, sat across from him, sharing stories about island history. Several of my professional mentors and closest friends filled the rest of the seats. There was no tension. There was no subtle gaslighting. There was only genuine warmth and mutual respect. Elias stood up, tapping his silver fork against his crystal wine glass. The table fell quiet, and all eyes turned toward him. "I would like to propose a toast," Elias said, raising his glass toward me with a warm smile. "To Tessa, a woman who knows the true value of a historic foundation both in real estate and in life. May your doors always remain locked to those who do not respect you, and may your table always be full of those who do." I smiled, picking up my own glass of vintage Bordeaux. I looked around the table, taking in the smiling faces of my chosen family. I had lost the family I was born into, but I had gained the entire world in return. To family, I said, my voice filled with absolute peace, the ones we choose for ourselves. We clinked our glasses together and drank. The ocean breeze swept across the porch, carrying the sound of our laughter out into the night. Thank you so much for watching my story. If you have ever had to make the difficult decision to cut toxic family members out of your life to protect your own peace, I want you to know that you are not alone. It is the hardest step you will ever take, but the freedom on the other side is absolutely worth it. Let me know your thoughts on how I handled Garrett and my mother in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Never let anyone convince you to give it away.